When a homeless boy with a voice like no other sings to a billionaire's dying daughter, something unimaginable happens, something that not even money, doctors, or science can explain. Can a single song truly change the course of fate? The world will soon find out. Elijah's voice was a soft echo against the clattering trains and bustling crowds of the subway. His presence, ragged and unnoticed by most, was dwarfed by the towering, polished world above him. Yet his voice, rich with something otherworldly, rang out, piercing through the steel and concrete, drawing a rare pause from the hurrying commuters. It was haunting, fragile, a melody born of the streets, yet it held the weight of something eternal. He didn't know it, but his singing was the only thing that brought him peace in a world that often seemed indifferent. The harmonies wrapped around him like a thin blanket, shielding him from the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. His voice was all he had left to give, and it was the one thing no one could take from him. A man, sharply dressed in a suit that cost more than the rent on the apartments nearby, slowed his step as he passed by. His eyes, cold and calculating, watched the boy for a long moment. Elijah didn't notice the man at first. His focus was entirely on the melody that flowed from him like water over rocks. But the man's presence lingered, unsettling in its intensity. When the song ended, the stranger's voice broke through the silence. "I heard you. You've got something," he said, his words strange in their bluntness. Elijah looked up, startled, his heart beating a little faster. I just sing," he mumbled, unsure how to respond. People never really noticed him, not beyond the occasional sneer or side-eye. "I know what I heard." The man's gaze was steady, unnervingly so. He pulled a business card from his pocket, its edges sharp against the worn paper of Elijah's torn jacket. "There's a girl, sick, one of the Whitakers. You've probably heard of them." Elijah shook his head, confusion clouding his mind. The Whitakers. The name was foreign to him, lost in a world far beyond his reach. The man continued, oblivious to his ignorance. "Her name is Isabella Whitaker, billionaire Samuel Whitaker's daughter. She's dying. They've tried everything, but nothing's working. They need someone special, and I think that someone is you." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Elijah didn't understand it at first. How could someone like him help someone like her? He was just a kid, nothing more than a shadow in a world of glittering glass towers. But the man's eyes told him he wasn't joking. This was real, and this was an opportunity too rare to pass up. "Why me?" Elijah's voice was barely above a whisper, disbelief threading through the question. The stranger smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll understand soon enough. You have a gift, Elijah. Don't waste it." And just like that, with a single glance and an impossible request, Elijah's world shifted. The boy who once sang only for solace would now sing for a chance to change everything. Isabella Whitaker lay motionless on the expansive bed, her once vibrant eyes now dull and tired, as though the weight of her illness had slowly drained all the light from them. The soft silk sheets tangled around her pale body, but she barely noticed. The room surrounding her was one of opulence, a space filled with rich textures and glistening gold accents, yet it felt cold. No warmth could penetrate the chill that had settled inside her, the cold of isolation and the relentless grip of a disease that refused to release its hold. The finest doctors, the best treatments money could buy, nothing had worked. Samuel, her father, a self-made billionaire, whose empire had been built on ruthless ambition and the crushing weight of every deal he'd made, had spent fortunes in the pursuit of saving his daughter. He had never been one to accept defeat, never one to bow to the power of something as intangible as fate. But this was something different. The disease had no name, no face. It had simply appeared, insidious and unstoppable, and now it ravaged Isabella's body with a force that nothing could halt. Every doctor, every specialist, every breakthrough promised had led to another dead end, another empty hope. And as she lay in the tower of his mansion, high above the world, Samuel could only watch helplessly as his daughter slipped further away from him. She was his legacy, his everything. His empire would mean nothing without her to inherit it. And yet, the more he fought to save her, the more futile his efforts seemed. The soft click of his office door opening broke the silence. A young assistant, barely older than a teenager herself, stepped inside, her face tense with urgency. "Whitaker," she began cautiously, her eyes darting toward the bed where Isabella lay. "There's someone here to see you." Samuel's brow furrowed. He looked at his daughter, her breathing shallow, her skin cold despite the heat in the room. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. The assistant hesitated before speaking again. "A boy. He says he can help. He's a singer. I believe you were told about him." For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning elusive. A singer? Help? Samuel didn't know what to make of it, but he had reached a point where anyone, was worth considering. "Bring him in," he finally said, his voice devoid of the authority it usually commanded. Desperation had replaced it. As the assistant left, Samuel stood and walked toward his daughter's side, brushing a lock of her hair away from her face. "We've tried everything, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But if this boy can help, we'll give him a chance. Just hold on." His words, though meant to comfort, were nothing more than empty promises. He had no idea how much a simple song could change everything. Elijah stepped through the massive front doors of the Whitaker mansion, his worn shoes scraping against the polished marble floor. The house seemed to swallow him whole, the towering walls and the pristine, silent air making him feel even smaller than he already was. His clothes, ragged and stained from days on the streets, stuck to his body, and he could feel his nerves crawling under his skin with each step he took further inside the world of wealth and luxury he had never known. He was led down long corridors, past rooms filled with treasures he could only dream of. The sheer extravagance of the place made his chest tighten. He didn't belong here. He was just a boy with a voice, nothing more, nothing less. But the gravity of the moment pushed him forward, his every step guided by an unspoken promise he didn't fully understand yet. At the end of the hall, a door opened into a room that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Inside, Isabella's mother, Jacqueline Whitaker, stood near the window, her posture straight, her expression weary. She was a woman who had once been full of life, but now she seemed aged by grief and the unbearable weight of her daughter's suffering. Her eyes were red, the skin beneath them hollowed by sleepless nights. She was used to fighting for Isabella, fighting for control, but today she looked like a woman on the edge. "You must be Elijah," Jacqueline said, her voice a mix of skepticism and something deeper, desperation. "Come in." Elijah hesitated just outside the door, unsure of what to do next. This was it, the moment he'd been told to prepare for. He could feel the tremor in his hands, the weight of the eyes on him, but all he had to do was sing. That was all they'd asked of him. He stepped inside. There, lying on the bed, was Isabella, pale, frail, the life drained from her as if it had been siphoned away, leaving her little more than a shadow of the girl she used to be. Elijah's heart clenched as he took in the sight of her. The stark contrast between her fragile form and the opulence of the room hit him like a wave. How could someone who had everything still be dying, and how could he, just a kid with a song, possibly change that? Jacqueline watched him closely, her eyes darting between Elijah's face and her daughter's still form. She didn't say anything, but the desperation in her gaze spoke volumes. Elijah swallowed hard and stepped closer to the bed, his throat tight. The room felt too quiet, too heavy, and he knew that this moment could be his only chance to make a difference. "I'll do my best," he said, though the words barely seemed to belong to him. Jacqueline nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Please do whatever you can." The silence that followed was broken only by the trembling sound of Elijah's voice, small at first, like a bird learning to fly. But as the song filled the room, something shifted. Jacqueline's breath caught, and for the first time in months, Isabella stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Elijah didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would change everything. Elijah closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the room heavy with expectation. He stood in front of Isabella, her delicate frame lying motionless on the bed, as if the very act of breathing had become a struggle for her. The sterile smell of the room clung to his clothes, but it wasn't the smell of sickness or despair that filled his senses. It was the weight of possibility. His heart pounded in his chest, but as his fingers brushed against his throat, the anxiety began to slip away. This was his gift. This was the one thing no one could take from him. His voice. He opened his mouth, and the first note escaped, raw and unpolished, but it was enough to fill the room, to fill the space between him and Isabella. It was like a tremor in the air, a shiver down the spine of the universe. His voice cracked at first, the way a storm crackles before the rain falls, but then it smoothed, flowing with an unexpected clarity that made Jacqueline's breath hitch in her chest. Isabella's shallow breaths, which had been ragged and disjointed, slowed. Her chest rose with more ease now, each intake of air a little deeper than before. Elijah's eyes fluttered open, a crack in his composure, as if he had expected the song to fill the room, but not to reach into the very heart of the woman before him. As his voice swelled, so too did the change in Isabella. Her fingers, once lifeless, twitched ever so slightly, a small tremor that no one had expected to see in days. It was so subtle, so quiet, but in that moment, it was everything. The doctors at the foot of the bed exchanged looks, confused, stunned, afraid to believe what they were seeing. One of them leaned forward, checking the readings on Isabella's vitals. Her pulse, which had been dangerously erratic, had steadied. The oxygen levels, which had been too low, were rising. The heart rate monitor, once a constant source of concern, now showed a rhythm, steady and strong. "Is this?" one of the doctors whispered, unable to finish the question. Jacqueline's eyes were wide, her hand covering her mouth as she took in what was happening. She hadn't dared hope for a moment like this. For months, she had lived in the shadow of helplessness, watching as her daughter withered away. But now, for the first time, she saw the faintest glimmer of life return to Isabella's face. It was as if the song had breathed life into her, reigniting the spark that had been dimming for so long. Elijah sang on, unaware of the transformation happening before him. His body moved with the rhythm of the song, as if his soul was tethered to the very melody. The words, the notes, they weren't just filling the air, they were weaving through the space, binding the room together in something more than just sound. They were a promise, and for the first time in months, Isabella Whitaker, the girl who had been lost to a disease beyond understanding, felt alive again. Elijah's voice continued to flow, raw yet somehow perfect in its purity. Each note seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than it should, a weightless thing that shifted the very energy of the room. His eyes were closed again, his focus entirely on the song, his heart beating in rhythm with the melody. But as the sound swelled around him, something shifted between him and Isabella, something subtle but undeniable. It was as if their worlds, so far apart just moments ago, were now somehow connected, intertwined by the very music that filled the space. Isabella's breathing deepened, not just from the physical relief, but from something else, something unspoken. There was a change in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. She had been so far removed from the world outside her body for so long, lost in the grip of an illness that had taken everything from her. But now, for the first time in months, she felt something. It was not just the healing of her body, but the quiet awakening of a part of herself that had been dormant, a part of her that had given up hope. The song had reached into that space, pulling it back into the light. As her chest rose and fell in time with the melody, Isabella's hand, still trembling, found the edge of the blanket. It was small, almost imperceptible, but the movement was there, as if her body was beginning to remember how to live. A tear, the first in days, slipped from her eye, not from pain but from the overwhelming sensation of being alive again. She didn't know how or why, but she knew in this moment that something had changed. The doctors, standing at the foot of the bed, exchanged frantic glances, their minds racing to make sense of what they were witnessing. They had seen Isabella's condition worsen, had watched helplessly as her body became a shell of itself. And now, in front of them, they were witnessing something impossible, something beyond their understanding. Her vitals were stabilizing at a rate they couldn't explain. The once lifeless girl on the bed was slowly, quietly, coming back to life. What's happening?" one of the doctors murmured, his hand hovering over the monitor, unsure if he should believe his own eyes. "This isn't possible." Samuel Whitaker stood motionless, his jaw clenched tightly. The man who had built his empire on control, on wealth, on certainty, was now standing at the edge of something he could neither understand nor control. His daughter, once on the brink of death, was breathing deeply, her pulse steady. But was it the boy's song that did this? Was it truly the power of his voice, or was there something more at play here? He looked at Elijah, standing just beyond the bed, his face a portrait of quiet concentration. The boy didn't know it, but his voice was doing more than healing Isabella's body. It was igniting a fire deep within her, filling her with a sense of purpose she had long since forgotten. And as Elijah continued to sing, Samuel couldn't help but wonder, could it really be this simple? Could the impossible be happening right before his eyes? The air in the room grew thick with tension, as Samuel Whitaker stood at the foot of Isabella's bed, his gaze fixed on the monitors, on his daughter, who for the first time in months, was breathing with ease. Her color was returning, her face softening with the hint of life that had been absent for so long. The doctors stood quietly, their eyes darting between the readings and each other, clearly bewildered. But Samuel couldn't allow himself to believe it, not yet. Not after everything he had invested, everything he had lost. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "No, this doesn't make sense." He turned to one of the doctors, his voice sharp with authority. "Run every test you can, scan her, scan him. Whatever you have to do, make sure there's a logical explanation for this." The doctor, clearly taken aback, hesitated. "Mr. Whitaker, her vitals, they're stabilizing. We've never seen a recovery like this, especially not in such a short period of time." Samuel's eyes narrowed, disbelief etched in every line of his face. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let some boy, some unknown, homeless child, with nothing but a song, be the one to save his daughter. It was impossible. Nothing made sense. Money, science, the best doctors in the world, they were supposed to be the answer, not a miracle, not some boy. "I don't care what you've never seen," Samuel snapped, his voice cold. "Do your job. Get me answers." He turned to Elijah, who was still standing off to the side, unaware of the storm gathering around him. The boy was still humming the last few notes of the song, his face calm, his eyes closed, lost in the music. He didn't understand the magnitude of the situation. "You," Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out." Elijah froze, his heart dropping into his stomach. He had no idea what had happened to change the atmosphere in the room so quickly, but the cold, dismissive tone in Samuel's voice left no room for doubt. "Mr. Whitaker, Elijah's voice faltered. I just wanted to help." "I don't care," Samuel cut him off sharply. "I don't care what you think you can do. I'll handle my daughter's care from here. You're just a child who got lucky with a song. Now leave." The words hit Elijah like a slap. His mouth went dry, his chest tight with confusion and hurt. The song that had brought Isabella back to life, the connection he had felt, that had been real, hadn't it? But Samuel was looking at him with the cold indifference of someone who saw him as nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. "Please," Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's better. I can help." "I said leave." Samuel's tone was final, and it crushed whatever hope Elijah had left. With a last uncertain glance at Isabella, who now lay motionless once again, Elijah turned and walked out of the room, his heart heavy with the sting of rejection. Elijah stood on the stone steps outside the Whitaker mansion, his breath visible in the cool evening air, but his heart was warm with determination. He didn't belong here. He knew that. He was nothing but a forgotten child from the streets, a boy with a song that had somehow touched the unlikeliest of lives. But that song, his only gift, was still inside him, alive and real, and he couldn't just let it go. Samuel's rejection had been sharp, bitter, and it left a raw ache in his chest. But the ache wasn't enough to silence him. He had seen Isabella's eyes, had seen the change in her, as she listened to him. She wasn't just his song's recipient. She had felt it, deep within her. With that thought, Elijah closed his eyes and began to hum softly, a gentle tune that wound its way through the air, picking up strength with each passing note. His voice followed, steady though tinged with the weariness of a boy who had never been truly seen. But here, now, in the shadow of the mansion that had rejected him, Elijah sang for the one person who had ever truly heard him, the one person whose life had changed because of him. He didn't care if Samuel had sent him away. He didn't care if the doctors were baffled, or if the world thought him mad. This was Isabella's life, her fight, and she needed him. As he sang, something stirred within the mansion. A soft breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees nearby, and slowly, the large windows overlooking the garden creaked open. It was a sound that barely registered at first, but Elijah felt the shift. Inside, Isabella, lying in her bed once again, stirred. The song, his song, was reaching her once more. The soft notes caressed her, like a whisper from a world she had longed to return to. She closed her eyes, barely able to breathe without pain moments before. But now, with each note, her chest rose more freely. Her limbs, once heavy and unresponsive, began to twitch again, almost imperceptibly at first. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing, but the pain was less now. There was a strength stirring in her, something ancient, something fierce. The room seemed brighter, warmer as she listened, her heart responding to the melody that now filled her once silent world. She could hear it more clearly now, the song, as it grew louder, more insistent. It was calling to her, like a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty, and this time, she wasn't afraid to follow it. Her hand reached for the bedpost, her fingers trembling but determined. She pulled herself to her feet, her body weak but insistent. The song, the boy, it was her only hope, and she wouldn't let anyone, least of all her father, silence it again. She made her way to the window, her breath shallow, but full of resolve. There, just outside, standing in the fading light, was Elijah, singing his heart out, as if the whole world depended on it. And for the first time in months, Isabella smiled, her strength slowly returning with each note he sang. This time, she wouldn't let them take away her lifeline. The night was quiet, the moon casting a pale glow on the garden, where Isabella had slipped away from the mansion. She had learned to move in secret, to slip past the watchful eyes of her father's guards, and into the world outside, where the air was free of the sterile, suffocating smell of hospitals and medications. Tonight, she wasn't a sick girl confined to a bed. Tonight, she was someone else, someone with a chance to live. Elijah was waiting for her by the garden gate, his dark figure barely visible in the shadows. He had come for her, as he always did, singing in the space between the walls that held them apart. His voice had become a promise, a thread that connected them despite the distance, despite everything that kept them from truly being together. "You came," she whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and something else, something deeper. He nodded, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. "Of course, I came. You wanted to hear it again." She didn't need to say anything more. The song had become their secret language, their only connection in a world where everything else felt like a lie. Elijah had given her something no one else could, a chance to breathe without the weight of her father's expectations, or her illness bearing down on her. She could feel it in her bones, the strength returning, not just in her body, but in her soul. They sat together in silence for a moment, the soft rustling of the trees around them the only sound. Then Isabella spoke, her voice quiet, but steady. "You don't know what it's like, Elijah, to be trapped in a world where everyone around you believes your life is already written for you. My father, he spent millions trying to cure me. But nothing works, nothing will. And yet, he won't let go. He thinks that money, that power, will save me. But he doesn't see the truth." Elijah's brow furrowed, his fingers tightening slightly around the worn edges of his jacket. "What truth?" Isabella took a deep breath, her eyes downcast for a moment. "The truth is, my illness isn't the only thing that's been killing me. It's the weight of what's expected of me. My father's empire, his dreams, none of it's mine. It's all about what he wants, what he thinks will bring him peace. But no matter what he does, it doesn't bring me life. It only takes away everything that makes me feel alive." She paused, and in that silence, Elijah could feel the depth of her pain, the burden of being someone's shadow instead of her own person. It was a heavy thing, too heavy for someone so young, so full of life in the quiet spaces between her struggles. "I don't want to be anyone's dream, Elijah," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to be my dream. I want to live, truly live." Elijah leaned in, his voice low and steady, the sincerity in it unmistakable. "Then you will. You're already stronger than you think. Your father, he doesn't see you, but I do." The words hung between them, a promise that neither of them had the power to break. They were no longer just a boy and a girl, no longer a disease and a cure. They were two souls, connected by something that transcended all the things that tried to tear them apart. And together, they would find a way to face the world. Together, they would fight for her life. The sun had barely risen when Samuel Whitaker stormed into Isabella's room. His face set in that familiar hard line of a man who always believed he was right. His eyes, sharp with suspicion, settled on Elijah, who was standing near the window, the soft light illuminating his face. "Out!" Samuel's voice was icy, a single word laced with authority. "You have no business being here." Elijah flinched, but he didn't move. There had been moments when Samuel's words felt like stones thrown in his direction, but he had learned to bear them, to stand firm despite the weight of them. "I've told you before," Samuel continued, his voice rising with barely contained frustration. "This is nothing more than a trick. You're just a boy who got lucky with a song, and now you're pretending to be some kind of miracle worker. My daughter's life is not something you can play with." The words stung more than Elijah had expected. He had hoped, at least, that the change in Isabella's health would make Samuel see reason, that he would understand, but all he saw was doubt, wrapped tightly in disbelief. Isabella, who had been lying quietly on the bed, her eyes now open and clearer than they had been in months, turned her head slowly toward her father. Her gaze, once weak and fearful, was now filled with something else, something Samuel had never seen before. Defiance. "Father, stop." Her voice was steady, almost too steady for someone who had been on the brink of death just days ago. "Stop treating Elijah like he's nothing. He did something for me. He saved me." Samuel's brow furrowed in disbelief. "Isabella, you don't understand. This is not how things work. He doesn't have the answers. He's just a boy who sings in the streets. He doesn't know what he's doing. You don't understand." Isabella's voice cut through his words, sharper than he had ever heard it before. "You think your money can fix everything, that it can buy my life back, but it can't. It's his song that brought me back. Not your money, not your doctors, not your wealth. Him." Samuel took a step forward, his face dark with anger, but Isabella held her ground. Her strength was palpable, the fire in her eyes undeniable. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten, her own power. "Elijah is not going anywhere," she said, her words firm, her gaze unwavering. "I need him. I choose him." Samuel's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't respond right away. The silence that followed hung thick in the air, as though the world itself had paused, waiting for him to speak. For a long moment it seemed as though he would argue, demand that Elijah leave and never come back. But then something in him seemed to break, a small crack in the impenetrable armor he had built over the years. "I will not allow this," he muttered, but his voice was no longer certain. His eyes shifted between his daughter and the boy, as though seeing them for the first time, as though he were realizing just how little he controlled. Isabella didn't wait for him to make another move. "You can't stop me, father. I'm not your possession. I won't let you decide who I am, or what I need anymore." With that she turned her eyes back to Elijah, a soft smile forming on her lips. She was finally free, and no amount of money or control could take that away from her. Not anymore. The media storm hit like a hurricane, unexpected and unstoppable. What had begun as a quiet, personal miracle, Isabella Whitaker's recovery, was now headline news, plastered across every news outlet and social media platform. The world was gripped by the inexplicable. How had a billionaire's daughter, once near death's door, suddenly come back to life, revitalized by the song of a homeless boy? Rumors swirled like wildfire, each outlet trying to capture the truth, dissecting every detail, questioning the impossible. How could a song, a simple voice, have this kind of power? Was it a miracle? Was it fraud? No one could decide, and the questions only fueled the media frenzy. Elijah, once an invisible boy on the streets, now found himself thrust into the spotlight. The camera flashes, the reporters' microphones, they were everywhere, capturing his every move. They wanted to know his story, to find the truth behind the mysterious boy who had saved the Whitaker heiress. But for Elijah, it was all too much. His face, once familiar only to the shadows, was now on the cover of magazines. His name was suddenly whispered in the halls of power and media, a name that meant something, but not something he had asked for. The more they questioned, the more they tried to pull apart the layers of the story, the more dangerous it became. The media couldn't stop asking, how did a homeless boy heal a billionaire's daughter? What was his secret? But no matter how many interviews he gave, how many questions he answered, there was always more. And in their eyes, Elijah was just the puzzle piece. They couldn't quite fit into their neat, tidy world. At the heart of the storm stood Samuel Whitaker, his fury barely contained behind his calm, practiced smile. His empire, his reputation, had been built on control, and now everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers, crumbling before his eyes. Samuel's next move was swift, deliberate. A lawsuit, filed against Elijah, demanding the boy be discredited, accused of fraud, of manipulating Isabella's health for personal gain. The accusation was baseless, of course. The media spun it as the desperate attempt of a billionaire, trying to protect his wealth. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. In the courtroom, the stakes were higher than ever. The press was watching, their cameras aimed at every motion, every word spoken. Samuel's lawyers painted Elijah as a fraud, as nothing more than a boy who had preyed on a vulnerable family. They turned the song, which had once been a symbol of hope, into something dark, something untrustworthy. Elijah stood in the courtroom, his eyes wide with uncertainty. The boy who had saved Isabella now found himself fighting not for her life, but for his own. His song, his gift, was under attack, as if it were the very thing that had brought all this turmoil upon him. And yet, through it all, Isabella stood by his side, unwavering. She had found the strength to fight for herself once more, and now she would fight for him. The battle between them, against the weight of power and money, was just beginning. The courtroom buzzed with a tension that crackled in the air like static. Cameras flashed. The hum of reporters' whispers filled the space. But Elijah stood at the center of it all, barely able to breathe. He had never asked for this, never sought out the spotlight. He had only wanted to sing, to help, to be something more than the invisible boy the world had forgotten. Now he was trapped in a fight for his freedom, his worth, his very future. Isabella's condition had taken a turn for the worse in the days since they'd been separated. She had been kept away from him, under strict orders from her father, who believed it was the boy, his voice, that had given her life. Samuel saw Elijah's influence as a threat, something he couldn't control, something dangerous to his carefully crafted world. But to Isabella, it had been her lifeline. Without Elijah, the world had returned to its shadowy corners, the pain in her body stronger than the faint hope she'd held onto. Each day her health deteriorated further, her once strong body fading back into the frail, lifeless shell it had been before. And in the silence that surrounded her, all Isabella could think of was the sound of Elijah's voice. The way it had filled her with life, the way it had carried her out of the darkness and into the light. It wasn't just a song, it was something deeper, something they shared, and without it, she couldn't breathe. Elijah, too, was at his breaking point. He had given everything, sacrificed his anonymity, his safety, his place in the world, all to save her. He had watched her regain strength, watched her hope return, only to have it ripped away when Samuel closed the doors, when the world branded him a fraud. He didn't know how much more he could lose. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't give up on her. Not when she was so close to slipping away again. In front of the world, with the eyes of doctors, reporters, and Samuel all focused on him, Elijah took a deep breath. The weight of the moment pressed against him, suffocating, but he stood firm. He couldn't let the doubt, the fear, the scrutiny break him. He closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of his heart, and the quiet determination that had carried him this far. He began to sing. The first note was soft, trembling, but it built, growing stronger with each breath he took. His voice rose into the space, cutting through the tension, a raw and undeniable force. The sound wrapped itself around Isabella, who lay motionless on the bed, her eyes barely open. But even in her weakened state, she heard it. She felt it. She felt it. She felt him. The monitors in the room blinked, their numbers changing as Isabella's vitals began to steady. Her hand, which had been cold and still, twitched. Her breath deepened, the shallow rhythm of life returning to her chest. Elijah's song was no longer just a sound. It was the bridge between their worlds, the proof that what they shared was real. By the time the final note left Elijah's lips, the room was silent. The world watched, breathless. And in that silence, the undeniable truth hung in the air. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't chance. It was connection. It was belief. It was the power of the human spirit, of love and hope, and a song that had changed everything. The silence that followed the final song was heavy, but it was different this time. It wasn't the oppressive silence of doubt or uncertainty. It was the silence of realization. In the moments that passed, as Isabella's breath steadied and her color returned, Samuel Whitaker stood in the middle of the room, utterly still, his eyes fixed on his daughter. The truth he had spent months denying, the truth he could no longer avoid, was laid bare before him. His empire, his fortune, his control, had meant nothing in the face of this. The millions he had spent, the countless doctors he had hired, had all been in vain. It hadn't been his wealth or his power that had saved Isabella. It had been a song. It had been Elijah. The boy who had once been invisible, discarded by the world, now stood before him, a symbol of something Samuel could never have bought: hope. Hope that didn't come wrapped in expensive treatments or shiny promises, hope that had no price tag. Elijah's eyes met Samuel's for the first time without fear, without uncertainty. There was no longer a need to justify himself. His voice had spoken for him. And now, there was nothing more to prove. "Your daughter is better," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady. "That's all that matters." Samuel's jaw tightened, but the words he had wanted to say, those accusations, those attempts to diminish the boy, died on his lips. What could he say now? That his money had given him control over life, that his influence had the power to change fate? No, the truth stood before him, undeniable. Isabella, now sitting up on the bed, glanced at her father. For the first time in her life, there was no fear in her gaze, no desire to please him, to follow in his footsteps. She was her own person now. She had found something worth living for, not the dream he had built for her, but her own. "Father," she said, her voice firm, "I am not yours to fix. I'm not a possession to be saved with your money. I have the right to choose my life, my future." Samuel stood there, speechless, but in his eyes was a flicker of something he had never expected to see: regret. Regret for all the years he had spent, trying to control her, trying to shape her into the person he had imagined, instead of letting her become the woman she was meant to be. With the battle for Isabella's life over, something else began to take shape. A new world, one where belief in the unseen could create change, where the impossible wasn't something to be feared, but something to be reached for. Elijah had shown them that. Isabella stood up, her feet steady beneath her, her strength returning with every step. She walked over to Elijah, and without a word, placed her hand on his shoulder. He had given her her life back, and now, together, they would shape the future. A future not defined by wealth or power, but by something far more powerful: faith in the unseen, and the belief that even the most broken pieces could be mended. The world had been watching, and now they had seen what was possible when the impossible was believed in. And for the first time, Isabella was free. If you believe in the power of the unseen, the strength of the human spirit, and the impossible becoming possible, don't forget to subscribe and share this story. Let's spread the message that hope and faith can change everything. No matter who you are, leave a comment below, and tell us, what do you think is more powerful, money or the heart?